All right, well, I want to be mindful of time so that we have plenty of time for discussion. More folks might join as I give my introduction, but that's all right. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the AI Institute for Next Generation Food Systems Spring Speaker Series. My name is Hannah Bartram, and I'm the Education and Public Engagement Coordinator for APHIS. And today we are delighted to welcome Scott Forsberg, COO of Sonomaceuticals. Scott will discuss Chardonnay wine grapes as a new model for upcycling byproducts into value-added finished products and how artificial intelligence can contribute to this. Before I introduce Scott, let me give a quick introduction to the AI Institute for Next Generation Food Systems, also known as AIFS or APHIS. The Institute was established in 2020 under an NSF USDA NIFA grant with the mission of developing and leveraging transformative AI for the ethical production and distribution of safe, sustainable, nutritious food with fewer resources. APHIS is a multidisciplinary collaboration between researchers at 6 different institutions conducting research with a holistic, integrated view of the food system. If you would like more information on the research and engagement activities of APHIS, please visit our website and connect with us on social media. Researchers at APHIS are solving challenges in molecular breeding, agricultural production, food processing and distribution, and nutrition, while also focusing on the ethics and socioeconomics of AI in the food system. And our 3 main research focuses are food system and supply chain resiliency, AI infrastructure development for food systems, and AI-driven food systems to improve human health. Our speaker series features thought leaders addressing food system challenges using artificial intelligence, and this spring series has been themed around AI opportunities in food waste reduction. This is the final talk this spring, but all the recordings of our previous speakers can be found on our YouTube channel, so please catch up with any that you missed there. We look forward to hosting new speakers this fall. And if you go to our website, you can sign up to get on our newsletter and hear about the other activities of APHIS and upcoming speakers in our series. So without further ado, today I am delighted to be introducing Scott Forsberg. Scott is the Chief Operating Officer of Sonomaceuticals, LLC, whose mission is to pioneer the use of wine co-products for foods and nutraceuticals. Scott is also the founder of Forsberg Group LLC, a natural products consultancy group and a 35-year veteran of the industry. Scott is active in industry trade groups both in the US and abroad. He served a 3-year elected term on the board of directors of the American Herbal Products Association as that organization's government relations committee chair. And as an avid outdoorsman and scientist, he believes that combining the best of nature and science is the key to a healthy, sustainable future. Today's discussion will be moderated by Harold Schmitz, co-founder and general partner of March Capital US LLC, and a senior scholar in the Graduate School of Management at UC Davis, as well as chair of APHIS's Industrial Advisory Board. Thank you so much for joining us today, Scott. I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, and thanks for the introduction. So, Sonomaceuticals has been basically in this space for a long time. We've been looking at the use of Chardonnay specifically for maybe the past 5 or 6 years, but prior to that, we were really looking at grapes in general from winemaking. And so part of our journey was to dig deep into the different varieties of grape and try to figure out, what they could be used for, how to valorize that particular waste stream. So we've really been at this for quite a while. And in doing that, we've accumulated a fair amount of data. And one of the things that became apparent as we moved through this journey of trying to figure out how to get what we call a higher, better value out of the grapes than was currently being done, whether it was composting or using it as fertilizer or whatever. It became pretty apparent that there was a huge amount of not just potential, but information that we were accumulating that was very hard to prioritize and understand. In other words, the complexity that we were dealing with, it just continued to increase. You would think that as you dug further and further and deeper that you would start to simplify things, but that's actually not the case. It seemed like every time we went a layer deeper, what we found was increasing complexity, increasing depth of information that made it difficult to really kind of get our arms around what are the best things that we should be looking at. How do we prioritize? How do we enable really the amount of information that we were creating? So I'm going to take you through a little bit of our experience with using AI to try and help us cut through that complexity and understand better what we should be acting on that was actionable, that would actually create results for the company, results both in terms of our mission and also in terms of revenue and company performance. So let me just grab this. Okay, can everyone see that?
Looks good.
Great. So when Sonomaceuticals was first conceived of back in 2009, obviously the idea was to treat the product that came out of the winery as food and not waste. We wanted simply to increase dietary complexity, and that would lead to improved global food security and human health. So fairly non-specific in that way. But what we did know is that one of the things that was really important to us was that we establish leadership, at least with regards to Chardonnay, if not to wine grapes in general. And why is that the case? We actually did work with the USDA. We did some work with the Western Human Nutrition Research Center there on the Davis campus as well, trying to figure out which of the varieties of grape that we had access to would actually prove to be the one that was the best for human health. Surprisingly, in doing that work, we looked at 8 different varieties, including 3 red varieties and well, more than that actually, but it was 8 varieties in total. So we looked at Cab, Merlot, Pinot Noir, Zinfandel, Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay. It escapes me what the 8th is. But in doing that, we were trying to figure out what could have the greatest impact on human health. And it turns out that Chardonnay rose to the top. If you looked at the aggregate information that was accumulated, and this work was done by USDA, not by us, what we found that was for improving and specifically, we were looking at markers of metabolic health. So what most people would think of as, let's say, metabolic syndrome. So that's cardiovascular health, blood sugar control, liver health, essentially the metabolism of fats, carbohydrates, and energy into food, and some of the resulting kind of lifestyle issues that come from that. Chardonnay consistently performed better than any of the other varieties in all those models. So that was interesting, and that was an interesting learning for us. So we decided that Chardonnay was what we would focus on, and we decided that establishing leadership in Chardonnay, in understanding what it is and how it can help human health, was one of our first goals. The second was that we wanted to create revenue. And the third is that we wanted to develop a pipeline for future offerings. And those are both offerings of branded products to consumers and also of ingredients that we could sell to other companies that they could incorporate. So that was the framework that we used when we started looking at both establishing the business and more specifically, establishing a program using machine learning and data analytics that could help us to reach those goals. So that framework led to the establishment of what we would call a data engine. And that data engine had several different kind of parts to it. The most obvious of which is just this kind of analytical chemistry piece. That part of it, the compositional analysis and the collection of information about what Chardonnay comprises of, that was where we really started and what we wanted to do. Because if we didn't understand what the material consisted of, what we had in the first place, then it would be difficult to understand what its downstream effects might be and where we could take that and create second and third generation products from it. So the analytical chemistry is where we started. We also already had some data. We managed to get an SBIR grant working with USDA to do some human work. So we had human data there. And then there was a variety of other sources of information, whether that was existing literature, third-party literature, published literature. We had sustainability metrics from our partner, which is Jackson Family Wines, that we could use to feed into the system. We had some general viticulture and enology work. And then we had also done a variety of, let's call it, in vitro simulation and modeling work, either using microbial organisms or animals. All of that was fed into the data engine. And what we wanted out of that, of course, were insights, right? So scientific evidence that Wellvine, which is the product that we create using Chardonnay, actually did have a role in human health. So the first brief that we put together for our data analytics engine and for the project was to use AI to predict outcomes. So we wanted it to identify surprising therapeutic areas. And what we mean by that is we already knew that it had a role in, as I talked about, metabolic syndrome and cardiovascular health in particular. We wanted to know if there was something that we hadn't thought of, something that wasn't obvious, that wasn't just a parallel or adjacent space to this kind of metabolic space. We were also hoping that we could use that data to essentially take the place of human trials. So what we wanted to do was not spend as much time and effort on establishing efficacy data, but instead use AI to create some of that data and see if it couldn't replace it. Then we wanted to identify opportunities for innovation. So this would be obviously novel applications, like the surprising therapeutic areas would be one example of that. But we also wanted, novel processes or perhaps sources, identifying particular ways in which Chardonnay could be grown or places that it could be taken from, and synergistic combinations of Chardonnay and other ingredients that could be used for these same indications. And then lastly, we wanted to have a data engine that had ties to the primary wine business. So understanding the way the plant is grown, what the genetics of the plant are, perhaps even looking at the microbiome of the soil or other parameters, et cetera. So pretty broad, actually, and very far-reaching goals that we had initially. And we thought the data analytics could help us with all of that. What we found when we actually tried to implement that was that while that vision might be doable, it wasn't doable in the short term, and it wasn't doable with the amount of information that we had available to us. So when it came to using AI to predict outcomes, for example, we did have one hit on a surprising therapeutic area, but it turned out to be very difficult to implement because the very novelty and the fact that it wasn't very close to what we were doing already meant that we had a lack of data surrounding that indication, and we would have to build it from the ground up. So while the novelty was interesting, it represented an opportunity for us that was very difficult to capitalize on. It would have essentially caused us to have to go back and start from the ground up and rebuild everything that we were doing. Secondly, when it came to replacing human trials, empirical data is still the gold standard, both from a regulatory point of view and for most scientists. So even though it was interesting, it really didn't serve as a replacement. It was more of an adjunct to it, or a way of looking at it that was a little bit new that might be able to help us when it came to design or to implementation, but that we couldn't replace entirely the human trials that we were thinking of. When it came to identifying innovation opportunities, as I kind of described above, when it came to novel processes and sources and synergistic combinations, at that time, the information was just too broad. There were too many things that we could choose from. So we had a lot of data out there, but we had no way to prioritize it, no way to parse it, no way to come up with something that was actionable. Instead, it was just a huge amount of raw data that didn't really give us a better sense of what should we act on first, how should we work at it in a stepwise fashion, et cetera. So it needed refinement. It needed refinement and focus. And then the last one, frankly, it was just too ambitious. And the main reason was because Sonomaceuticals, even though, we're connected to a wine company, we're not a wine company. We don't actually grow the plants. We don't do the farming. We don't do all of that. So the truth is we just simply didn't have enough data. We learned that there's a critical mass that you need when it comes to any data analytics project that we hadn't managed to achieve yet. So the data that we were putting into it was insufficient to be able to draw any real conclusions. So the quality and quantity of data, in other words, that we understood to be a lot more important than we had initially thought it would be, and therefore this particular thing was just too ambitious and not doable at that time. So we went back and we revised essentially our strategy and revised the brief for what we wanted to do with data analytics. And we took a much narrower view. Essentially, we started looking at it not as a way to necessarily innovate all by itself, de novo, using the data analytics engine or using AI to create these things for us without a lot of input from us. Instead, we looked at it as a way to de-risk and accelerate the conventional processes that we were already using. And secondly, we targeted what that innovation should be in a much more granular way. So instead of just casting a broad net and expecting AI to both prioritize, identify, and then come up with ways in which we could implement it, we took the burden of saying, here are the things that we think have the highest value for us, the things that we really know that we have data of sufficient quality and quantity to be able to do something meaningful with. And we targeted our project to those outcomes. So in this case, we decided that the project that we were going to work on was using AI to predict outcomes in gut health, and not just gut health broadly, but one very narrow and specific aspect, which I'm not going to talk about right now because we're still working on it. It's somewhat proprietary, but know that within gut health, there are a number of different parameters that you can look at, which are aspects of gut health. We've identified one specific aspect of that and decided to concentrate our efforts there. Now we could go back and we could look at all the data that we had before and the data that we'd accumulated and identify compounds and phytochemicals of interest with that specific outcome in mind. So using that as a lens to focus our efforts, we suddenly started getting much more meaningful data than we did when we were casting this really broad net. It also allowed us to create a lexicon for scientific and consumer language. So part of the strategy wasn't just to create products, it was also to create communication messages. We wanted to publish papers. We wanted to become a thought leader. We wanted people to understand what it was that we were trying to achieve through not just studying and publishing on Chardonnay, but actually creating products that would be useful for people. And part of what we had to do is make sure that the language that we were using was the same language that was being used in other publications that would resonate with consumers, et cetera. And that made a difference when you were doing AI that was basically going out and looking at both scientific and popular language itself. So if the language of your marketing and your product development efforts don't mirror the language that's to be found by people who are looking for reinforcement or who are looking for other sources of information that parallels what you're saying, then those efforts are, in some cases wasted. So we needed to make sure that was standardized. And then we also decided that not try to replace, a human clinical trial, but instead identify the best biomarkers for these trials, identify the best clinical models, whether those were in vitro, human, animal, or whatever, and make our process more efficient. So when I talk about de-risking it, we're talking about looking at the risk that you have from doing empirical studies and just kind of, hoping that you've designed it properly, that you're measuring the right things. We wanted to have a higher degree of confidence in that. And that higher degree of confidence means that not only were we willing to place bigger bets when it came to doing that work, but we believe that it could be done both in a less costly way, quicker and with a greater confidence that the outcome would be positive. So really what all of these things mean is that we see AI not as a replacement for human efforts, but as a way to augment our efforts such that we can do it faster, cheaper, and with a higher degree of confidence. And before, we were looking at it as just a completely different way to do these things that would replace a lot of what we were doing instead of refine and enhance and make them more efficient. So then we would take that information and we would identify innovation opportunities from it. So the best processing options would be a natural outgrowth of understanding what the compounds and phytochemicals of interest were, what language we were using to describe it, and how it was studied and how the efficacy was actually proved. Same thing for the synergistic combinations that would be built on that phytochemical profile. So those were a natural outcome of our newfound understanding of really what the tool could do for us. And we came up with goals then for the project based on what I just showed you that was very specific. So first of all, we were going to do the analytics. We had deadlines and we had very specific deliverables that we wanted out of the process. The first was to establish that composition specification that I talked about. The second was to identify the synergies. And the third was to come up with an experimental plan for efficacy that had lower risk associated with it, that was faster to implement, and that could, because of those things, actually end up being cheaper. From that, we would then create multiple grades or iterations of the product. And then we would move into an innovation phase that could even be something like planning for a next generation product that would be in a different category other than just food or dietary supplements, like medical foods. So I think that what we learned from this is that there are several key components to an actionable program for using AI or data analytics, machine learning, whatever you want to call it, to actually create something of use for you. One is you need targeted inquiries. So you continue to define and refine over and over again. And that means that you don't just, fire and forget. You don't just create the project and then let it run. You actually have to dip in and out as the data analytics is being done over time to make sure that you reassess and retool if necessary. And that requires a human element to it. It requires curation that is essentially teaching the machine learning model how to give you what you need and what you want out of this process. So you have to keep looking at it. We all know that machine learning is an iterative process, right? The machine learns things, then it knows what's right and what's wrong, and it goes back and it makes an adjustment to the way that it does its work based on that input. That input largely has to come from human beings, and it has to come both at the beginning of the process through being very specific and as the process continues in order to make it work well. And then the third one is data discipline. So the way that we accumulate data now and how we store it, how we categorize it, what we call it, all of that, we're much more disciplined about it than we used to be. So whenever we do any kind of basic science or basic research, one of the questions that we always ask ourselves is, will the data be of sufficient quality and quantity? Will it be in a format that works to be able to be used in AI? And is the vocabulary and the terminology and such standardized in a way that it can be used with previous and with, successive efforts in gathering the same kinds of information so that there's, carryover and consistency throughout the entire process. So those are kind of the key learnings that we got out of this. And it took us a while to do it. We've been doing this for the last a little more than 4 years, actually. And here are some of the things that I've really decided are important out of it. Just for curiosity's sake, I decided to ask ChatGPT what it thought would be the best way to approach a program like ours. So I asked it, what is the best use of AI in researching Chardonnay grapes for human health? Interestingly, it came back with something that was pretty similar to what we had. So identifying compounds, predicting the effects of processing, recommending optimal consumption patterns, which is a little different than what we had, although I would argue that's part of the work that we were doing on definitions and vocabulary and lexicon. And then lastly, developing new health products. So no real surprises there. what was interesting was its summary, and it said overall the best use of AI in researching Chardonnay grapes for human health depends on the specific health benefits of interest. Now, in a way, that just sounds like a disclaimer or a qualifier, like it's hedging its bets. But actually, that's the thing that made the biggest difference for us, was having a very specific health benefit we were looking at, identifying needs, and giving the data analytics engine a better starting place, and frankly, more restrictions rather than it being broader. In this case, the utility and the ability to create something useful, it came from limitations on what we asked AI to do, and putting up proper borders rather than just simply opening it up and allowing it to do anything. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was a really, really great overview and deep dive in with specific examples. So we'll move into the conversation and discussion portion of our talk today. And I know, Harold, you have some questions prepared. Maybe we could kick things off with the question that is in chat now that relates to one of your earlier slides, Scott. Mark asks, how did you choose which Chardonnay pomace made it into your trials? Sources, organic, biodynamic?
That's an interesting question. So when we were looking at it, we were looking at it primarily in the beginning from the point of view of what would be the most bioactive product that we could get. So where did we think that we could source the material from that would give us the highest levels of phytochemicals and such of interest? And what we found is that, and this is true of not just wine grapes, it's true of, a lot of crops in general, that a certain amount of stress is necessary in order for the plant to produce the best characteristics, right? So if it's too easy for the plant to grow, if it doesn't have to struggle at all, if there's no stress at all, then what you find is that it produces relatively little of those defensive compounds, which are often the compounds of the most interest. A good example, the tomatoes that they grow that they use to source lycopene from, most of it is grown in Israel. They grow them out in the desert, and they actually add salt to the water. And the reason they do that is because it stresses the plant. So you don't want the plant not to be able to survive, but in stressing the plant, you end up actually activating those genes, those defensive genes that cause it to produce phytochemicals that are of interest. So we started looking around, and what we found was that coastal and mountain Chardonnay that was grown at higher elevations, that wasn't grown in like the low-lying areas of the Napa Valley where it's just really easy for those grapes to grow, that was actually a better place for us to get the product from. And the more interesting products, the more interesting grapes were grown in those regions. So that's one of the things we looked at. When it came to organic and biodynamic, we've looked at some of that. We haven't really quantified it. And part of the reason is simply because the amount of product that's available in organic and biodynamic form is still actually relatively low. So just from a scale up and commercialization point of view, those really weren't a viable way for us to get enough product to be able to make a meaningful difference.
Great, thank you for that explanation. That clarifies things. And I would encourage other participants to put questions in the chat as they come up for you. But Harold, I'll let you take over with your questions.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Scott. That was really, really excellent. As you were giving that answer, I was just wondering if ChatGPT would have given the same answer or not. But I don't think so, actually.
I don't know. It'd be interesting to find out. I think it would be, again, this is the thing I've learned. How you ask the question, the addition of one or two words makes a huge difference, right? So if you were to put something into the question that you asked about the relationship between a stressful growing environment and the nutritive density or the nutritive quality of a plant, maybe it would come up with something better. So you kind of give it a little kickstart or a little head start, and it might actually do a better job.
we had Gail Taylor, who's a professor at UC Davis in plant science, and she led a session, I think it was last year or thereabouts, but it was on using AI to accelerate plant breeding. And, this piece about the tomatoes and the stress there, and then the molecular compositional differences inherent in the different types of Chardonnay. I mean, that's, it's coming at it from different respects. Obviously, she's using different tools and techniques and whatnot, but it all ends at this molecular composition place and the differences. So that just your answer reminded me of that. Given your extensive experience in the dietary supplements industry, and so before we sort of jump back into the wine grapes and Chardonnay, but just sort of zooming out to your dietary supplements experience, I mean, how would your career be different if you had access to the sort of AI tools that you just described to us? Like, do you have examples with your work with ginkgo or polyphenols, green tea, anything else?
Yeah, so one of the projects that I worked on early in my career actually was helping to identify what it is in cranberries that prevents urinary tract infections. So we ended up using a bioassay, which was finicky and difficult to use because it required, it was very user dependent. So the technician that was doing the bioassay, if they were good and they had a lot of training, they had a lot of experience, you got good results out of it. And another person who hadn't done it very, very much or very often, you could give them the protocol, you could show them how to do it, but there was some art to it, and it was hard to get to that place where you could actually use the bioassay meaningfully. I think if we'd had AI to begin with, that we probably could have taken some shortcuts in the way that we actually got to a chemical assay and understanding what it was in cranberry that was creating these effects much, much faster than just through this trial and error system of using a bioassay and doing differential fractionation, et cetera, et cetera. So that would have been really exciting. It would have shortcut the development of that project, I'm sure, tremendously if we'd had that tool available to us. The other thing that I'm excited about, just when it comes to natural products in general, is that when I started working in this industry 35 years ago, most of the time you were taking a whole herb or a whole plant source as the supplement. Increasingly over time, what's happened is you not only get extracts, but now purified substances. So green tea, which I think is a tremendously useful plant in lots of ways for people, there was a point at which you could buy 99% pure EGCG, epicatechin gallocatechin. And that particular substance is useful in a way, but it's not nearly as useful as the entire plant is. Part of the reason that people do that is because they can tell a story about it much better. It's easier to study and easier to model. But there's a reductionist mindset too about the way these things work that's borrowed from the pharmaceutical industry, right? So you have a single substance, usually a small molecule that's used to treat a disease or whatever. And they're highly effective, but they also have lots of side effects. And they're only useful when you're trying to intervene in biology that's already profoundly disturbed. So nutrition and dietary supplement products, foods, essentially, both of them, they should be used to keep healthy people healthy. And in order to do that, you need whole food sources with pleiotropic effects, lots of phytochemicals, lots of nutrients acting in concert with one another. That kind of complexity, which is what we're trying to get more of in the diet and understand better, it's very difficult to study without the use of a tool like AI. So I'm tremendously excited about AI's ability to restore the nutrition and nutraceutical industries back to that idea of using whole foods, whole food matrices, rather than using these reductionist and highly purified, single entity approaches to human health and human nutrition.
That's a great perspective. There's It's been noted by some folks. Justin Siegel, who's a UC Davis faculty member, uses this in some of his presentations, but it's been noted that during the first half of the 20th century, there were several Nobel Prizes awarded for essentially discovery about food and nutrition and health. And then in the second half of the 20th century to date, now in the 21st century, essentially no Nobel Prizes have been awarded in this area of food and health and nutrition. And somehow it's linked to what you were just saying, which is, there was, as biomedical science and health science has advanced, the complexity of food and what's in these substances has just kind of overwhelmed what the state of the art of the reductionist, sort of field has become. And hopefully, to your point, that predictive analytics and advanced data analytics can sort of reopen this back up and make it tractable. That was a really great perspective. So kind of building on that, and I know there's another question that's popped up. So after I ask this question, we'll get to that one. But building on that, your presentation you laid out, which was really gracious of you, so thank you very much. You laid out a really great playbook, honestly, for a lot of people to sort of look at and study, be it on the academic, government, or industry side. Did you come to that yourself through sort of blood, sweat, and tears, or are there other companies out there that you looked to and were inspired by? How does the space look like? Or do you feel like you're forging new ground as a pioneer, or are you learning from others, or a mix, or what's your view on that?
Well, I certainly don't claim to know what the entire landscape of endeavor is like in this area. So you see other companies doing things, whether it's, I talked about cranberry. So I've seen with interest what Ocean Spray is doing with Brightseed and with other companies as well. And I actually work with a flavor and fragrance company, one of the larger players in that industry, and they're very active and interested in this space too. So I kind of have a little window into seeing what they're doing. And I think there are two things that maybe are different about our approach. One is that these large companies, billion-dollar enterprises, they can afford to spend a lot of time and have a lot of misses. So it's really not that big a deal to them if they spend, $10 or $20 million on something and they end up saying, well, we learned what not to do. They can afford to do that. They can also afford to keep accumulating and looking at data over time until it reaches that critical mass that I talked about earlier, right? So they can, create a large data warehouse, dump a lot of data into it, and over time, let that kind of naturally ferment and coalesce in a way. We can't do that. We have to be a lot more efficient. So efficiency drives, in my opinion, some level of both innovation and also a level of clarity about what you're trying to do. And one of the things that I think that even some of these large companies still don't get is that machine learning and AI, it's not, the analogy I've heard is it's a magic 8-ball. You dump a bunch of stuff into it, ask it a question, shake it up, and it gives you this answer. You have no idea how it got that answer, no idea where it came from. You just have faith in it because you believe in this thing that you've created, right? I don't see it that way at all. I think the more you know about the process and the more you understand that process, and the more that your people and the data analytics partner you work with are specialists really in that area and work in that area consistently, the better the information that you get out of it. So I think it requires a lot of specificity. It requires a lot of going back and forth during that iterative process that I talked about, which is the machine learning part of it. You have to, insert yourself into that and understand what's going on there and make some corrections if you need to along the way. Those things, I haven't heard a lot of people talking about it or a lot of people doing it yet. And I've also heard people talk about how the technology, the sheer horsepower of their, computing platform or the sophistication of the algorithm, that those things are the most important. I would argue they're all fairly equivalent from what I've seen, and it doesn't make that much difference. What makes a huge difference is the way that it's designed, the people who are running it and curating it, and the people who are tutoring and teaching the machine learning system what to do and when to do it. So I look at it again, and this is what I said when I was talking about de-risking. I look at it as a way to do the things that you would normally do, the processes that you would normally try and do with people and with experts, cheaper, faster, and with less risk of being wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not fundamentally a different process.
That was a really good description. So Hannah, do you want to read the question that's come through?
Sure, yeah. David asks, are there any new data sets you are planning to add and explore, or is there still plenty to discover from your current data set?
That's a really interesting question. It's something we have to ask ourselves too. It's always tempting to go and say, hey, we see a thread here that we can pull on. Let's follow that a little bit further. So, that thread may be a phytochemical that we identified that there isn't a lot of data on, but that could be interesting because it allows us to, for example, get some IP because it's fairly novel and not a lot of other people have looked at it. It could be a synergistic effect that there's, one or two reports of that we could follow and go further with. And there are a lot of things in, our current data set like that, which are either nascent or in their infancy that, we could continue to spend a lot of time at. I would argue that rather than looking at it as how much more potential is there in our current data set, it comes down to, again, what are your goals? What are the questions you're asking? What specifically do you want to do with that information? And that will kind of drive whether or not you need additional data in order to reach those goals, or whether those goals can be reached using the data that you have currently. So it's not about, what is in the data set from a potential point of view. It's more about having a very specific and targeted goal, and then knowing whether or not your data set is sufficient and having to go out and do more with it. But in the long term, eventually, we'll definitely need to look at other data sets, and we may decide that there are areas of exploration that we're looking at, which we simply don't want to develop the in-house expertise for. And so we go out and we source an external data set specifically to avoid having to invest in that and create the infrastructure ourselves.
Thanks. That's a really thoughtful way to go about that.
Cool. So I'm going to ask you to play university administrator now. So if you were king or queen for a day, what would you do with this situation, which is, how would you suggest that APHIS and the new Resnick Center, which is a center that has received a contribution from the Resnick families to be, so it's I think $50 million, if I recall correctly, but a donation to Davis to establish sort of this center of excellence in upcycling, California-based materials into food. So how would you prescribe that APHIS interact with the Resnick Center and vice versa to really accelerate progress in the way that you were talking about earlier? So that's one. And then number two is, similar question regarding APHIS and the viticulture and enology department and the food science technology departments. And maybe it's the same answer for both, but those two things. If you were drawing it out, how would you draw those interactions to maximize the acceleration and progress you spoke about earlier?
Well, part of what I would do is common to both, whether it's the upcycling initiative that the Resnick Center has started, or whether it's viticulture and enology or nutrition or whatever. The advice I would give right in the beginning is pick something very specific to work on immediately. So don't just say, we're going to use AI on every project that we do, or we're going to, this is our new model for the way that we conduct business. Instead, say, with the Resnick Center, we're going to take one of your projects and we're going to do a deep dive into this process that I've kind of outlined, where you go in and you assess it, you look at the data quality and quantity, you understand what your goals are, et cetera, and you become very, very specific with it, and you demonstrate how useful it can be. And once you've created that model and you have that demonstration, then other projects naturally, not only will the people who are running those want to do that work and they'll understand the utility of them, but they'll have, again, a model to work with. So I think you have to be very specific, and the key in the beginning is saying no as often as you say yes, because trying to do everything for everyone, you'll end up not being able to do anything well, or anything that ends up, really being a showcase or a case study for what you're trying to accomplish. So that's the first thing I would say. The second one, though, probably applies more to the university and its different departments like nutrition, viticulture, and enology. And that is, I would sit down with the data analytics people and I would do data discipline training. So I would get these people to understand how you create data that can be used in an AI platform efficiently, how to standardize it, how to format it, how to make sure that you have data of sufficient quality so that it doesn't have to be cleaned up or changed or thrown out or whatever. So that data discipline piece of it should be part of the standard training that everyone does, so that when they do research and they create data, it can be fed into these engines in an efficient way, rather than having to go back, because we had to go back and, the first 5, 6, 7 years of data that we accumulated from Sonomaceuticals was of wildly varying quality, and it was reported in, lots of different ways, and it really slowed us down. If that had all been done under a disciplined system to begin with, it would have made it much easier to do.
That's great. Good perspective there. So and this probably builds off of this then, is if you were, say you had kids and they were going to college.
Which I do, and they are.
And they were interested, in some of the same things that you're interested in. What would you advise, what kind of curriculum would you advise, and how would you think about, are there course requirements that you think, food and ag, and should have that currently are not there, that would really, prepare them to have a job with you, Scott Forsberg, someday when you're interested?
So are we talking about specifically through the lens of this conversation about AI right now?
Yes.
Well, a couple of things I think would be really useful for people. Part of my background, which is probably somewhat surprising, I actually went to school on a debate scholarship. Mm-hmm. So I was trained in logic and rhetoric and all of these kinds of things. Even though I'm a scientist, I'm a microbiologist. I made my way through college by doing debate. And one of the things that I learned in debate very quickly is that you have to be careful not to overstate the quality of your data or what the conclusions can really be. So you find that people can pounce on you very quickly if, you take a source out of context, or you exaggerate the conclusions, or you do other things with it. And so I think everyone should understand better how to assess sources of information, and how to make sure that the way that they think about how authoritative it is, how conclusive it is, that training becomes second nature for people. In fact, I think just societally, it's one of the things that we really lack and that we could benefit from, right? Is this ability to read a post on social media or look at a news article and understand, is it credible? Does it hold up? Does it, meet standards for truthfulness and for consistency and such that are common? That's something that science teaches in one way, rhetoric teaches in another way, but there are commonalities to all of it. And I think that could be really important. So I think just basic understanding of, the quality of information that you get and how to assess it is a really important tool. And that's one of the things I talk with my kids about, frankly, because I think it's really important. I don't know what courses you would take in a university that do that for you. I know that a variety of courses together create that. So you take certain courses in science, you take other courses, in logic or philosophy or whatever. But I don't know that there's one course that's ever been created which does that from the ground up as a single course. I think that would be really interesting to see if there's a curriculum about that and a way of doing that. And I'm sure there is. There probably is. I just don't know of it. So I would encourage every student to have that kind of training. The other thing that I think is really interesting and important is people should be trained in how to interact with these AI tools. So rather than saying, hey, stop using ChatGPT, it's a form of cheating or it's a form of plagiarism or whatever, teach people how to ask ChatGPT the right questions, how to use that information then to incorporate it into their learning process and their process of creating things. I think we need to embrace it rather than fearing it or staying away from it. I think we need to understand how to interact with those tools better. So there ought to actually be training for it. Training in how to frame questions properly, how to be specific enough that you get answers that really give you what you want out of the process. And those are probably the two things that I can think of that would be basic skills common to everyone, regardless of what discipline they're working in.
Cool. That's great. So data quality definitely permeated that big time. Honestly, some of the slides you laid out in your approaches, I was just sort of imagining, a course that could be built on that. It's like how to accelerate innovation in, food and ag sciences, et cetera. But one last question I have probably before we run out of time would be, you talked a lot about the technology push side, which is the innovation pipeline, new product development, better understanding the raw materials, et cetera. So that's the creation of products. Then there's the consumer pull side, which is, that interface in the public with consumers in the retail sector. So, ag is only as valuable, food and ag, as the value of the products it sells on the market. So, do you have thoughts from your Sonomaceuticals experience or your general dietary supplements experience as to how AI could be used better on the consumer pull side of the equation?
Yeah, I do. The first thing is that we're dealing with food, which is intimately connected with quality of life for people, even if it doesn't impact their health. And in fact, in many cases, in spite of the fact that it impacts their health negatively, right? So people largely consume foods for emotional reasons. They don't consume them for physical reasons or rational reasons of nutritive quality or quantity very often. Some people do. There's a certain subset of the population that's very aware of that, but most people don't. And so the sensory aspects of food are extremely important. And I probably should have talked about that. That's one of the things that we've actually done, in addition to looking at the health benefits of the constituents of Chardonnay. We've actually looked at those same constituents and how they affect sensory aspects of it. One of the patents that we have is using Chardonnay that we've applied for. It hasn't been granted yet, but it's using Chardonnay to decrease the bitterness of other foods that you might eat. So, and that's important because if you don't have food that appeals to people on a very basic level from, taste and aroma and everything point of view, it's very difficult to change behavior. You can't change behavior just simply by giving people rational information. Doesn't work very well. You have to appeal to them in other ways too. So that's really important. And I think actually AI can help to establish and understand what some of those patterns are. We're starting to experiment with that even now. The other thing, though, I think that's really important is to understand how that perception of, different foods and how they can impact health, how to express that in a way that's meaningful for people. So if you go out, for example, and you tell people that A product will it will improve endothelial health, that it will increase the health of the epithelium, which, results in the release of more nitric oxide, et cetera, et cetera. I love that stuff, but that's because I have some scientific background and training, and I know what those words mean. Most people have no idea what any of that is, right? Even if you tell them that it makes your arteries more healthy, they're still kind of foggy on it. But if you tell them, hey, this improves the blood supply to your brain so that your brain can do work better because your brain needs lots of oxygen, that starts to make some sense to people. They're like, oh yeah, I get that. And as you grow older, that blood supply diminishes because you just simply don't have as good a function there. And when the blood supply diminishes and your brain gets less oxygen, you can't think and you can't perform mental work nearly as well. That also they understand. So you kind of have to figure out what that is, those things that, are levers for consumers that will actually motivate them to change behavior. And then you have to work backward to incorporate or translate that language into something that's meaningful so that the data analytics engine or the people that you work with who are human researchers, frankly, can do the work in a way that can easily be connected, that those dots can be connected one to another.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Well, I think we're just about the top of the hour, so we're going to hit it right. So Hannah, I'll turn it back over to you. I mean, Scott, that was really great. I just want to say again, I mean, laying out really the trial process that you went through and, assembling that into the playbook was really, really helpful. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity to share it. We did have some pain along the way. So this is part just working on it and thinking about it. And a lot of people who are sincere and work very, very hard to do it. And part of it was just hard-won experience.
Yeah, I'd like to echo the thanks for the insights from your presentation and the thoughtful answers you've given today. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I think really valuable for our researchers and our partners to hear. And thanks, Harold, for leading today's dialogue. And again, Scott, we really appreciate your time, your expertise in sharing these perspectives. So have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.